Hello and welcome to another CPD talk. My name is Jasmine and today I'm going to be redoing our continuing competence talk that was released last year. The reason that this is being redone is because there is now a new generic competency format. This format is going to be used across the whole of NKPS and therefore this presentation is now applicable to all of the departments and not just blood transfusion. So I am going to redo the presentation from the beginning. If you have already listened to the first presentation, then there will be time points in the description box below to let you know when I'm going to be discussing the new competency format, if that's the bit that's going to be relevant to you. Okay, so what we're going to go through in this talk is the good old way and UCAS, bad examples of competence and good examples of competence, how CPD can help, and finally we will go through those new competency formats. So, the good old way. In the past, it has always been enough if your senior members of staff acknowledge your competence, whether this be via discussion or witnessing you completing the task at hand. This would allow you to practice in the laboratory. This then changed slightly to have written competencies, including questions or tick boxes, to show that someone has actually assessed the staff member's competence. However, with the introduction of UCAS, the expectations surrounding competencies has changed. They have to be evidence-based. The term evidence-based can be used to describe different practices. So in general, evidence-based means what you are doing is based on some form of evidence. So if you are a doctor working on a ward, then what you do day to day will be based on something that has evidence that that is the most effective way of treating that patient. When we're talking about evidence-based competencies, what we're saying is if someone who is external comes in and looks at your competencies, they show on their own that you understand the protocol that you are going to be performing. So this could include things like sample numbers that they can just look up and see that you have done the procedure yourself. It could include things such as written answers to questions, so you've got the documented evidence that you understand them. There are lots of different types of evidence. We're going to go through that later. There are a few myths surrounding evidence-based competencies. The biggest one and the scariest one is that they're going to take longer to complete. And while this can be correct in certain circumstances, obviously it's going to be a lot quicker if someone is sitting next to you and just ticks off, yeah, you know what you're talking about, rather than you having to write things down. However, they don't actually take that long because a lot of the evidence you're going to gather in your day-to-day work. Obviously, if there are lots and lots of questions, then it will take longer. And if the competency is a complex one, then again, it's going to be a longer version. But if it's something where you have to collect sample numbers, then all you have to be doing is your job and remembering to take note. There are several advantages to using this format. As I said, one of them is that anyone can come in and see that you understand what you're talking about. However, there are other things, such as if you know you have filled out an answer to a question and you're not 100% sure what something is when you're doing it in the lab, I don't know, a year or so later, you can go back and find your competency and see how you answered that question and use that to inform your practice. It also means that stuff that you might not come across every day in the lab, if you're spending the time to answer a question on it, then you're going to be more likely to remember it than if you've just read something about it in an SOP. So we're going to go through some bad examples of competencies and the way that they are completed. The biggest one is a half filled out competency. So having a competency that's not completed, whether this be that the trainee has not signed something or the trainer hasn't, it doesn't show competence. The whole competency must be completed before you start performing a task unsupervised, and it is both yours and your trainer's responsibility to ensure that the competency is completed before you start completing the task. The next is if your competency is out of date. Each department will have their own rules on how long a competency is valid for. In general, it is 2 years within NKPS, unless you're in blood transfusion, in which case there are some different rules which we're going to go through later. But if your competency has expired, then you're technically not competent, so you shouldn't be performing that job until you have been reassessed as being competent. Tick boxes are generally not something that is good as a show of competence. Firstly, because anyone could have ticked that box. Secondly, because if it is the trainer that's ticking or signing that box and someone else comes in, they don't know what you've discussed. They don't know that you even sat down. That could be anyone writing something there. It doesn't show that something has happened. And someone just writing the term observed or witnessed. This is not a good way of showing competence. If you sit and write what has been observed, then that's completely fine because you're showing that you've sat down and you've done something with that person. Just writing the term observed or witnessed doesn't really show that you've watched anything. The next is discussed. Again, if you have a discussion with someone, let's say they've written out an answer to a question and it's not quite right, you should write down what you discussed. It doesn't have to be a huge long paragraph, just a generalized discussed such and such with this person as they didn't understand it, showed clear understanding after discussion. And GMP. So GMP stands for Good Manufacturing Practice, and it's something that we should be doing in all areas of the lab. People seem to think that when it comes to competencies, you can ignore that standard, but that's not correct. So when you complete your competencies, they should conform to the GMP standards. Therefore, if you make a mistake, you shouldn't scribble it out. You should cross it out of one line, sign and date it. They should be legible. Just because you can read what you've written, if some examiner comes in and they can't read what you've written, then how does that prove any competence there? And again, it must be recent as already specified. Now we're going to go into the good examples of competence and what we hope that these new competency formats and actually the old competency formats were achieving. So there are lots and lots of different good examples of competence, and some of them do stem from the bad examples of competence. So these include things like sample numbers, annotated pieces of work, procedures that you've completed, Q&A, reflections, witness statements, and we'll go through those in more detail in a second. But something I do want to point out is when you're collecting evidence to show that you can do something, you don't need to go crazy with what you're doing. So for example, if you're showing that you know how to authorize a specific test, there's no point in you taking down 50 sample numbers of a normal result for that test, because after you've done 2 or 3, it's obvious that you understand that procedure. When you're gathering evidence, you want a range of different bits. So say you've got that test, you want something that's a normal, you want a low range, you want a high range, so that you're showing that you know how to investigate all of the different outcomes. So moving on to some of the other good examples, annotated work. So this is sort of like the optimum of what you can get, because it's not only going to show that you've done something, because it'll have your name next to whatever it is that you have performed in the laboratory. It also then shows that you understand why, because you're annotating the information to explain what you're seeing. Here I've put 2 different examples of this, one where it's handwritten and one where I've typed it up. Both are acceptable. You can type up answers to your competencies, that's perfectly fine, and if you know you've got bad handwriting, then it probably makes more sense to do so. The next thing we've got is sample numbers, which is what I've gone through previously. Again, they are a very good, quick, efficient way of showing understanding of the procedure. While we're on this side, I do want to bring your attention to the reflective statement that is there. I mentioned that reflective statements are a good way of showing competence. This is not a good reflective statement. What it's saying there is, I have fated several batch products previously and am aware of the procedures in place and how to deal with the errors. I have not reflected on anything that has happened there. I have just stated fact with no evidence to back that up. When you reflect, you should state what you have done, and then after that you should state how it went well, why we do it in that way, or what could have done better. And that is what a reflective statement is. The next example of good evidence is IPEX or NEQAS. So in blood transfusion we use IPEX, but I know it's not used in other departments, and this is a procedure that we use to show that we understand the knowledge behind what we're doing, because it has questions and answers in it. So it's a really good way of helping prove competence in certain areas. NEQAS is used across all departments, so it doesn't have the benefit of the use of background scientific knowledge, but it does show that you know how to run the machines and how to interpret the results, so it can still be a really useful tool in proving competence. To make these robust pieces of evidence, however, doing a reflection on your result, for example, if you get any errors, reflecting on why those errors occurred, shows learning and can then also be used as your CPD. Next, we've got questions and answers. So this is probably going to be the one you come across most in your competencies, because they are the easiest way of assessing your background knowledge for both the trainer and for you. And they are a good way of doing this. The only issue with this is that people can sit with the SOP open in front of them. I will say, in general, most of the people that train you will be familiar with the SOPs, so we will probably notice if you copy and paste the answers. But this is why in some departments we have procedures in place where you have to sit away from the SOPs to complete your competencies. And really, while you're doing it, it's good practice for you to take yourself away from those SOPs, and then questions you struggle with, you can say, oh, okay, so this is something I'm not sure of, and I will need to make sure that I review that part of the SOP. And finally, reflections. So I've mentioned reflections a couple of times. They're a good way to show learning, and a good way of making a bad thing positive. Furthermore, any CPD learning that you do, you should complete a reflective learning on as well, just to make it a good piece of evidence, and it's what the IBMS will ask you to do if you apply for a CPD diploma. Talking of CPD can actually be a really good way of maintaining competence. While competencies are obviously an essential part of laboratory practice, if you're completing a pipette competency, for example, and then go on a course on pipette use, then this can count towards some of your evidence. If you need something where it says demonstrate correct use of pipettes, and the talk you've gone to on the pipettes involved you using them, then you could use your certificate from this as part of your evidence. So although there will be suggested evidences to produce as part of your competencies, there will be times where you have something that's better than what we suggested. It's always worthwhile trying to bring that to your trainer's attention, because if it can cut down the work that you have to do for it, it'll probably cut down the work that we have to do as well, which is always a bonus. Okay, so I'm done waffling on about good evidence and bad evidence, and we're now going to move on to the competency format. As I said, NKPS have finally agreed on a competency format that will be used throughout the whole of pathology, which is really great. We're very excited for it. It is, however, important to note that these are adaptable to each department, as they should be, because each department and each competency you complete will have different requirements. Therefore, I'm going to go through the overall use of the competency, but depending on what department you're on and which competency it is, it may be slightly tweaked to work better in that situation. So please follow the guidance that is given to you. This is what the front page will look like. I have filled out a competency template with a CSR competency. This was used just as an example when we were deciding on the format, so just bear with me here. The front page will have information on what site you're working on. It will have which grades of staff this is applicable to. Your name should be filled out and the date that you start training, and then it will have required reading. So this will be the SOP relating to it and any other documents that you need to read before you should be seen as being competent. And the other thing it's going to have in there is date reassessment required. As I said before, most departments that'll be every 2 years, but that will vary. It then has a little note on it where it says, where possible, Evidence, such as sample numbers, annotated screenshots, written answers, or documented observations should be given to prove competence. So this is sort of what we've just gone through. Any evidence highlighted in yellow is preferred but not essential to prove competence. So I'm sure that you all have certain procedures that you don't perform every day, and they will be harder for you to gain actual sample number evidence. Therefore, they'll be put in yellow because that's going to be the gold standard of evidence you can produce. However, because you may not have done that procedure in a while, you can still write an answer to that question. So you have that option as well. If this is the first time this competency is being completed, all applicable sections should be filled out. Any subsequent times, for example when new versions are released, only the sections in red text require evidence-based completion. So this might be because a procedure is slightly changed, so there's no point you completely repeating all of the questions because you've already shown that you understand them, but there will be a couple of new questions, so we want you to complete those. Now we get onto the actual part of the competency that you'll be filling out. This is going to be formed of several tables. At the beginning of the table, I have what evidence is required for that table. So in this case, you've got observation. For the competence, we've got, is the assessee wearing personal protective equipment? Your trainer will then write next to it, they are wearing full personal protective equipment and demonstrate proper health and safety, and then they can sign it off. So on this section, you just need your trainer there to write out their observations. You've then got the second table, which is the example you'll see more often, where you've got evidence required for this section, written assessment, and you've got an extra column there where it says evidence, and this is where you'll write an answer. So you've got the question there, why is it important to check referral test lists before processing any sample, and the evidence you would write the answer to. And then where it says discussion observation details, your trainer will put any feedback. So if you've missed something, they'll write it on there. If you've got it wrong, they'll write it on there. If it's good, they'll say good, and then they'll sign and date it. This is an example of the highlighted sections. So you can see here we've got what checks do you need to perform on a daily basis to ensure that the emergency blood is suitable for use? Why are these important? So technically you can write an answer to this, and this will be in the table where the evidence required is written assessment, but it's better if you were to annotate the cross-matching checklist. And finally, in some competencies, you'll have a last little table which is called reflection section, and this can be used in one of two ways. The first is to address any issues that have come up in the training, and the second is to create more robust pieces of evidence. So for example, if you're doing one on taking phone calls, on the reflection section it might say reflection on phone call that went well, or something that's required. Depending on the competency will depend on whether the reflection section is required or not, or whether it's even there. The next thing I want to address is that we've made it so that you can have one competency that's applicable to several different bands. The way that we do that is the section at the end of that evidence required, in brackets it will say band 2s plus or band 5 and over. So it will sort of give you an idea as to whether or not you need to complete it. So if you're a band 3 and the question says band 5 and over, then you don't need to do that question. It's not applicable to you. If you collect any external evidence, like you've annotated a checklist, etc., then this is just put at the back of your competency alongside it, and it'll be stapled together and put in your training folder. The other thing to bear in mind is you can cross-reference. So if you've gathered evidence for one competency and another competency is asking you a similar thing, then you can say, please see so-and-so in this competency, instead of wasting your time rehashing the same information. That's about it on the new competency format. Hopefully that's all made sense. As they start to be rolled out through pathology, it will become more and more obvious what I'm talking about. But if you do have any questions, obviously you can talk to your training officer, or if you want to, you can email me. We're now going to come to the maintaining competence section, which is about what you do after you're competent. As I've said several times. Each department has their own procedure for this. However, most departments, with the exception of blood transfusion, require reassessment of competence every other year. So again, please discuss with your training lead for further information. Now this next section is only applicable to blood transfusion. When I went through this previously, the information on annual updates was still a bit wishy-washy because we weren't 100% certain on what we were doing with it, and it was still in development. We've now come to an agreement on how we're going to do this. It's still going to be every year, and every year you will have to do your GMP. You will have to show that you've read all of your documents. You'll have to do your quality update, and you will have had to do a NEQUESS and an IPEX. What we are now going to do though is, instead of having you complete background questions every single year, is these are going to alternate. So 1 year you will be given background questions to do, which is what we have just done, and then next year you will be expected to gather evidence. So there is now a form on QPulse, which I will link in the description box below, that has an outline of all of the evidence that we expect you to collect throughout the year. This sounds like a lot of work, but it really isn't. We just need a few sample numbers for each, and it's going to be a lot less labour intensive than having to do those background questions every single year. So we're hoping it will make it easier for you in the long run. And then obviously it's showing that you are performing the procedures instead of us just quizzing you on your background knowledge constantly. And that is pretty much it. So hopefully the thing about the annual updates makes sense to the blood transfusion staff. If not, I am going to be sending out some information about that once it's all sorted out and completed. But until then, I would like to thank you all so much for listening to this talk. I would like to thank the Training and Education Committee for helping us to get the new generic competency template out and about. And I hope that you all understand a bit more about evidence-based competencies. So yeah, so you're aware the new competency format is on QPulse. When I created this talk, it was still in draft. So if you do want to have a look at it, that's the document number. Just have a look under the draft version of it, and then you can have a look at what you're going to be in for moving forward. Thank you so much for listening. Bye!